The year was 1945. In a modest room overlooking the Atlantic Ocean in Virginia Beach, America's most documented psychic lay dying. Edgar Cayce's weathered hands, which had channeled healing for thousands, trembled as he struggled to breathe. His wife Gertrude sat beside him, watching the man who had spent 43 years in trance finally face his own mortality. But Edgar had one more message to deliver. One final reading that would be unlike any of the 14,000 that came before. As his consciousness flickered between this world and the next, he spoke words that would haunt those who heard them. Words so profound, so urgent, that even his closest followers couldn't grasp their meaning. "The great forgetting," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the ocean waves. "It comes, and humanity sleeps through its own awakening." Those present that January evening dismissed these final utterances as the confused ramblings of a dying man. They buried his words beneath their grief, filed them away with condolences and funeral arrangements. But tonight, nearly 8 decades later, as humanity stands at a precipice unlike any in recorded history, Edgar Cayce's final warning blazes with a relevance that will leave you breathless. What did the sleeping prophet see in those last moments? What truth was so important that his soul refused to pass until it was spoken? And why, in our time of unprecedented global awakening, do his final words suddenly make perfect sense? To understand the weight of Edgar Cayce's final warning, you must first witness the extraordinary legacy of the man who delivered it. Born in rural Kentucky in 1877, Edgar was a simple photographer who discovered an impossible gift, the ability to access what he called the universal mind while in deep trance. For over 4 decades, Edgar Cayce delivered readings with an accuracy that astounded both skeptics and believers. He could diagnose illnesses in people he'd never met, prescribe remedies using medications that didn't yet exist, and reveal past life connections that explained present-day challenges. Medical doctors who initially scoffed at his methods eventually became his most devoted advocates after witnessing impossible healings. In one documented case from the ARE archives, Cayce diagnosed a woman's rare spinal condition while she was hundreds of miles away. He prescribed a specific treatment involving a compound that wouldn't be discovered by medical science for another 15 years. When doctors finally followed his instructions, the woman experienced a complete recovery that conventional medicine had deemed impossible. But Edgar's gift extended far beyond medical readings. He channeled information about ancient civilizations, predicted world events with startling precision, and revealed the workings of karma and reincarnation with detail that transformed thousands of lives. His reading on Atlantis, delivered decades before archaeological evidence emerged, described technologies and timelines that continue to be validated by modern discoveries. Perhaps most remarkably, every single reading was recorded by stenographers and preserved in the Association for Research and Enlightenment archives. Over 14,000 documented sessions created the most comprehensive record of psychic phenomena in human history. Edgar Cayce wasn't just a mystic, he was a mystic whose accuracy could be verified, studied, and applied. This track record of impossible precision makes his final warning not merely noteworthy, but essential for understanding the spiritual crisis approaching our world. By January 1945, Edgar Cayce was exhausted. Requests for readings poured in faster than his aging body could accommodate, each one carrying the desperate hope of someone seeking healing or guidance. Despite his failing health, Edgar continued to serve, often giving multiple readings per day when his previous limit had been 2. Those close to him knew he was dying. The readings themselves had warned that his physical form couldn't sustain the intense spiritual work much longer. But Edgar pressed on, driven by a sense of urgency that seemed to come from beyond his conscious mind. On his final day of readings, something unprecedented happened. Edgar's secretary, Gladys Davis, noticed immediately that this trance was different. the room filled with an energy unlike anything she'd experienced in 20 years of recording sessions. The very air seemed to shimmer with cosmic intention. Edgar's wife, Gertrude, who typically conducted the readings, found herself unable to speak the usual opening words. A presence had entered the room, not the gentle healing energy that normally accompanied Edgar's work, but something vast and urgent. Something that carried the weight of universal concern. When Edgar finally spoke, his voice resonated with harmonics that hadn't been present in previous readings. Those present described, feeling as though they were hearing not just Edgar's voice, but a chorus of souls speaking through him. The reading that emerged spoke not of personal ailments or individual karma, but of humanity's collective destiny. "The veils grow thin," Edgar intoned, his words carrying implications that wouldn't be understood for decades. "The children of the new earth walk among you now, but the great forgetting threatens to consume even their light." Gladys transcribed every word, but as soon as Edgar emerged from trance, he collapsed. This would be his final reading, a message so cosmic in scope that it seemed designed not for the small group present, but for future generations who would face the challenges he foresaw. In that final reading, Edgar Cayce revealed humanity caught in the grip of what he called the Great Forgetting, a collective amnesia about our true spiritual nature that would reach critical mass in the early 21st century. He saw souls becoming so identified with physical existence that they would lose all connection to their eternal essence. Through Edgar's prophetic sight, you witness a troubling vision. Millions of people moving through their days in a kind of spiritual sleepwalk, mistaking their temporary earthly roles for their complete identity. Lawyers forgetting they are souls, having a legal experience. Teachers forgetting they are eternal beings sharing wisdom across lifetimes. Parents forgetting they are spiritual guides, nurturing other ancient souls in small bodies. This forgetting, Edgar warned, would manifest as unprecedented levels of anxiety, depression, and spiritual emptiness. People would feel hollow, disconnected, searching for meaning in external achievements while their souls starved for recognition. They would medicate symptoms that were actually signs of spiritual awakening, pathologize experiences that were attempts at divine communion. In one haunting passage from that final reading, Edgar described seeing souls crying out in languages they no longer remember, seeking home in places that cannot contain their vastness. He witnessed people experiencing profound loneliness, not because they were alone, but because they had forgotten how to recognize the divine spark in themselves and others. The great forgetting would create what Edgar called spiritual orphans, souls, incarnated on Earth who had completely lost connection to their cosmic family, their purpose, their very nature. They would wander through life feeling like strangers in a strange land, never understanding that their sense of not belonging was actually homesickness for their true spiritual home. But Edgar's warning wasn't about external catastrophe. It was about internal disconnection. He saw clearly that humanity would mistake the symptoms of spiritual amnesia for its natural condition, never realizing that the emptiness, anxiety, and despair were actually signs of a soul trying to remember itself. This forgetting would become so complete that people would consider it normal to feel spiritually empty, emotionally numb, and existentially meaningless. They would build entire industries around managing these symptoms rather than addressing their spiritual cause. But Edgar's final message also revealed hope embedded within the crisis. The same cosmic forces creating the great forgetting would simultaneously cause the barriers between physical and spiritual dimensions to begin dissolving, creating unprecedented opportunities for spiritual awakening. Through his dying vision, Edgar witnessed what he called the thinning of the veils, a phenomenon where the boundaries between our physical world and spiritual realms would become increasingly permeable. This dimensional shift would manifest in ways both beautiful and terrifying for those unprepared to receive it. You see through Edgar's prophetic sight how this thinning would first appear as increased psychic sensitivity in ordinary people. Individuals with no previous spiritual training would suddenly experience prophetic dreams, encounters with departed loved ones, and overwhelming intuitive knowing about future events. Children would casually mention conversations with deceased grandparents. Adults would dream of disasters before they occurred. Edgar foresaw meditation groups experiencing spontaneous collective visions, healing circles channeling energies that medical science couldn't explain, and prayer gatherings that would literally alter the fabric of local reality. The veils growing thin would mean that focused spiritual intention would carry unprecedented power to create change in the physical world. But this cosmic opening would also create dangers for the unprepared. Edgar witnessed souls becoming lost between dimensions, unable to distinguish between physical reality and spiritual perception. He saw people overwhelming themselves with psychic information they couldn't process, spiritual energies they couldn't integrate. In his final warning, Edgar emphasized that this dimensional shift would either elevate human consciousness to unprecedented heights or shatter unprepared minds completely. The same cosmic forces that could facilitate divine communion could also create spiritual emergency for those who lacked proper understanding and support. The thinning veils would act as both invitation and initiation, offering humanity the chance to remember its divine nature while demanding the spiritual maturity to handle expanded consciousness responsibly. Those who embrace this opportunity with wisdom and preparation would experience awakening beyond anything previously possible on Earth. In his final prophetic glimpse, Edgar witnessed something that filled him with both wonder and concern: the arrival of souls who would incarnate with their spiritual memories intact. These children would be born already knowing their divine nature, carrying ancient wisdom in young bodies, understanding humanity's cosmic purpose with crystalline clarity. Through Edgar's vision, you witness these remarkable beings choosing to incarnate during humanity's most challenging spiritual period. They would arrive not as saviors from above, but as fellow souls who remembered the truth that others had forgotten. Their very presence would serve as living reminders of what became possible when spiritual amnesia was healed. Edgar saw these children displaying psychic abilities from early ages, telepathic communication with family members, prophetic dreams that proved accurate, healing touch that relieved others' pain, and intuitive knowing about people's emotional states. But rather than being celebrated for these gifts, many would be misunderstood, medicated, or taught to suppress their spiritual nature. In one particularly poignant vision, Edgar witnessed a young boy trying to comfort his grieving mother by describing her deceased husband's presence in the room. Instead of recognizing her child's gift, the mother became frightened and sought psychiatric help. The boy learned to keep his spiritual experiences secret, his divine gifts hidden beneath the mask of normalcy that a forgetting world demanded. Edgar's final message emphasized the crucial importance of recognizing and supporting these incarnated souls. They carried within their consciousness the keys to navigating the spiritual transformation ahead. Their role wasn't to force awakening upon others, but to demonstrate through their example what became possible when souls remembered their true nature. But these children faced a profound challenge. They would often feel completely alone in their spiritual understanding, surrounded by adults who had forgotten the very truths these young souls carried so naturally. They would struggle with depression, anxiety, and a sense of not belonging that reflected their awareness of dimensions others couldn't perceive. Edgar foresaw that many of these gifted children would be diagnosed with attention disorders, mood disorders, or learning disabilities, when their real challenge was learning to function in a world that had forgotten its spiritual foundation. Their heightened sensitivity would be pathologized rather than honored, their natural spiritual abilities suppressed rather than cultivated. The sleeping prophet's warning was clear. Humanity's future depended on recognizing and nurturing these children of the new earth, for they carried the remembrance that could heal the collective forgetting, threatening to consume our world. Edgar's final vision revealed a particularly insidious aspect of the great forgetting, how humanity's growing dependence on external technology would mirror and accelerate the forgetting of internal spiritual technologies. He witnessed souls becoming so fascinated with outer innovations that they would abandon the magnificent spiritual tools already encoded within their divine design. Through his prophetic sight, Edgar saw future generations carrying devices that could connect them instantly with anyone on Earth, yet feeling more isolated and lonely than any humans in history. He witnessed people accessing unlimited information while losing the ability to access their own inner wisdom. They would rely on external navigation systems while forgetting how to trust their spiritual compass. Edgar foresaw the tragic irony. As external technology advanced, internal spiritual technologies would atrophy from disuse. Humans would forget they possessed natural telepathic abilities because external communication seemed more reliable. They would abandon energy healing because pharmaceutical interventions appeared more scientific. They would stop trusting prophetic dreams because predictive algorithms seemed more accurate. In his final warning, Edgar revealed how this technological dependency would create what he called spiritual amnesia by choice. People would voluntarily surrender their divine gifts in favor of external substitutes that seemed more convenient and socially acceptable. But Edgar's concern went deeper than mere replacement of abilities. He saw how constant external stimulation would fragment human consciousness, making the deep inner stillness required for spiritual communion nearly impossible to achieve. Minds would become addicted to external input, unable to tolerate the sacred silence where divine guidance naturally arose. Edgar witnessed souls losing the ability to distinguish between ego thoughts and spiritual guidance because their inner lives had become too noisy and scattered to perceive the subtle voice of higher wisdom. They would mistake mental chatter for intuition, emotional reactivity for spiritual guidance, and fear-based thinking for divine protection. The sleeping prophet's message wasn't a condemnation of technology itself, but a warning about allowing external devices to replace the divine technologies already present within every human soul. He emphasized that the same cosmic forces advancing outer technology could be used to enhance inner spiritual abilities, but only if humanity chose integration rather than substitution. Edgar's farewell message included visions of Earth herself, responding to humanity's spiritual crisis through accelerated natural phenomena designed not to punish, but to awaken. He witnessed the planet as a living, conscious being who would use increasing seismic activity, weather intensification, and climate shifts to shake humanity out of its spiritual slumber before the forgetting became irreversible. Through Edgar's cosmic perspective, you understand these Earth changes not as random disasters, but as Gaia's loving attempt to force reconnection between humanity and the natural world. Every earthquake would be an invitation to remember our dependence on forces greater than our technology. Every storm would be a reminder of our interconnection with planetary rhythms we had forgotten. Edgar saw clearly that as humans became increasingly disconnected from natural cycles, the Earth would amplify these cycles to demand attention. When people forgot to honor seasonal transitions, the seasons would become more extreme. When humanity ignored the intelligence of natural systems, those systems would respond with changes too dramatic to ignore. In his final reading, Edgar revealed that these planetary responses served multiple spiritual purposes. They would force communities to work together in ways that individual prosperity had made unnecessary. They would humble human arrogance about controlling natural forces. They would create opportunities for displaying the very spiritual qualities, compassion, generosity, courage, that the great forgetting was suppressing. But Edgar's vision went beyond mere awakening through challenge. He witnessed how earth changes would create energetic shifts that would actually facilitate spiritual awakening in those ready to receive it. Seismic activity would release crystalline frequencies that would enhance human psychic abilities. Atmospheric changes would create conditions more conducive to spiritual communication. Even climate shifts would force humanity into lifestyle patterns more aligned with natural spiritual rhythms. Edgar foresaw that those who interpreted these changes as punishment would experience them as trauma, while those who recognized them as awakening invitations would discover unprecedented opportunities for spiritual growth. The same earthquake that terrified the spiritually asleep would provide profound opening experiences for those prepared to receive Gaia's communication. The sleeping prophet emphasized that Earth's responses were expressions of maternal love, sometimes gentle, sometimes firm, but always designed to guide humanity back to remembrance of our sacred relationship with all life. In his final prophetic glimpse, Edgar witnessed the emergence of divine feminine energy as the primary healing force for humanity's spiritual amnesia. This wasn't about gender politics or social movements, but about the return of receptive, intuitive, nurturing consciousness that rational materialism had systematically suppressed for centuries. Through Edgar's vision, you witness this feminine, divine awakening first in individual women who would begin remembering their role as spiritual bridges between dimensions. These women would experience spontaneous psychic openings, profound healing abilities, and deep knowing about humanity's spiritual needs. They would serve as channels for the very energies required to heal the great forgetting. But Edgar's vision extended beyond women to include the awakening of feminine qualities within all souls, men and women alike, beginning to balance their overdeveloped masculine rational minds with the receptive wisdom of heart-centered knowing. He saw humanity learning to integrate logical analysis with intuitive perception, individual achievement with collective harmony. Edgar foresaw women's circles gathering worldwide, creating energetic networks that would literally weave new patterns of consciousness across the planet. These groups would work with lunar cycles, seasonal transitions, and sacred sites to anchor feminine divine energy in places where it had been absent for millennia. In his final reading, Edgar revealed that the return of the feminine divine would manifest as increased emphasis on collaboration over competition, healing over harming, nurturing over exploitation. Societies would begin organizing around principles of care and sustainability rather than dominance and extraction. But Edgar also warned about resistance to this feminine emergence. He witnessed how those most invested in maintaining systems of separation and control would feel threatened by the return of unifying, heart-centered consciousness. The awakening feminine would face opposition from structures built on suppressing the very qualities she represented. Edgar saw clearly that humanity's survival depended on successfully integrating feminine divine wisdom with masculine divine action. Neither alone could heal the great forgetting. Only their sacred marriage could restore the wholeness that spiritually amnesia had fractured. The sleeping prophet emphasized that this feminine emergence wasn't about replacing masculine energy, but about healing the split that had created an unbalanced civilization focused on external power while neglecting inner wisdom. Edgar's final message included crucial guidance about distinguishing between healthy spiritual awakening and spiritual emergency. He outlined specific warning signs that would indicate when the dimensional shifts and increased psychic sensitivity were creating crisis rather than growth. Through Edgar's medical training and psychic insight, you learn to recognize the symptoms of spiritual emergency. Overwhelming psychic experiences that couldn't be integrated, inability to distinguish between physical and spiritual dimensions, emotional instability from unprocessed spiritual openings, and loss of grounding in practical reality. Edgar foresaw individuals experiencing what he called psychic flooding, receiving more spiritual information than their consciousness could process safely. These souls would describe feeling bombarded by voices, visions, and energetic sensations that left them unable to function in daily life. Without proper understanding, they would often be labeled mentally ill and treated with medications that suppressed their spiritual sensitivities. In his final warning, Edgar emphasized that many experiences modern medicine would classify as psychosis or bipolar disorder might actually represent spiritual emergence, requiring guidance rather than suppression. He witnessed souls having profound mystical experiences being medicated into numbness, when what they needed was skilled spiritual support. Edgar described seeing people who could suddenly perceive auras around others, but had no framework for understanding what they were seeing. Others would begin hearing the thoughts and emotions of everyone around them, but lack the tools for managing such expanded sensitivity. Still others would experience spontaneous out-of-body travel, but become terrified by their apparent disconnection from physical form. The sleeping prophet's guidance included specific indicators of healthy spiritual awakening versus spiritual emergency. Healthy awakening included gradual expansion of consciousness with maintained connection to practical reality. Spiritual emergency involved sudden, overwhelming openings that left individuals unable to function in ordinary life. Edgar emphasized that the difference between spiritual growth and spiritual crisis often depended on having proper preparation, understanding, and support. The same experiences that could facilitate profound awakening could create severe instability if not properly integrated. His final message stressed the crucial importance of distinguishing between spiritual emergence and mental illness, as misdiagnosis could suppress the very spiritual gifts that humanity desperately needed during these times of collective awakening. The sleeping prophet's final guidance included specific practices for navigating the dimensional shifts safely while maintaining both spiritual connection and practical effectiveness. Edgar's recommendations emerged from decades of helping others integrate spiritual experiences with daily life responsibilities. His healing path began with what he called spiritual grounding, daily practices that would anchor expanding consciousness in physical reality. Edgar prescribed specific meditation techniques that would open spiritual awareness while maintaining connection to the body and breath. These weren't complex esoteric practices, but simple, accessible methods for staying centered during intense spiritual openings. Edgar's dietary recommendations focused on foods that would support psychic sensitivity without creating instability. He advocated for what he called consciousness-supporting nutrition, natural, minimally processed foods that would enhance spiritual receptivity while providing steady physical energy. He specifically warned against substances that would artificially amplify psychic experiences before the individual was properly prepared. The sleeping prophet emphasized lifestyle adjustments that would honor both human needs and soul requirements. This included maintaining regular sleep schedules to support natural dreaming and spiritual communion, spending time in nature to stay connected with planetary energies, and creating sacred space within the home for regular spiritual practice. Edgar's integration practices included journaling techniques for processing spiritual experiences, breathing exercises for managing overwhelming psychic input, and specific prayers for spiritual protection during periods of increased sensitivity. He provided detailed guidance for creating spiritual stability during unprecedented times of change and awakening. In his final message, Edgar stressed the importance of finding community with others navigating similar spiritual openings. He foresaw that isolation during spiritual emergence would create unnecessary suffering, while connection with understanding companions would facilitate healthy integration of expanded consciousness. The sleeping prophet's practical wisdom emphasized that Spiritual awakening needed to enhance rather than undermine effectiveness in daily life. His healing path was designed to support souls in becoming more capable, more compassionate, and more service-oriented through their spiritual development. Edgar's final guidance reminded seekers that the goal wasn't to escape human life, but to bring divine consciousness more fully into human expression, creating living bridges between heaven and earth. Edgar's ultimate message revealed that humanity's current spiritual crisis represents the culmination of collective choices made across centuries. The gradual preferencing of materialism over spirituality, separation over connection, fear over love. Through his cosmic perspective, you understand this moment as the harvest time for collective karma humanity has been creating for millennia. In his final reading, Edgar described seeing how each generation's choice to prioritize external achievement over spiritual development had contributed to the great forgetting now threatening to consume human consciousness entirely. Individual souls who had repeatedly incarnated to accumulate wealth, power, and status while neglecting their spiritual nature had created collective patterns of spiritual amnesia. But Edgar's vision also revealed that this karmic culmination offered unprecedented opportunity for healing these ancient patterns. The present moment contains what he called evolutionary pressure, cosmic forces that would either catalyze humanity's spiritual awakening or intensify the consequences of continued forgetting. Edgar witnessed souls who had spent lifetimes in spiritual sleep beginning to awaken spontaneously, drawn by internal recognition that their evolutionary moment had arrived. These individuals would experience what felt like spiritual emergencies, but were actually rapid healing of karmic patterns that could no longer be sustained. The sleeping prophet emphasized that this collective karmic examination couldn't be passed through intellectual understanding alone. It required genuine spiritual transformation at the soul level. Humanity would need to actually embody the love, compassion, and unity consciousness that religious teachings had described for millennia. Edgar's final warning stressed that this karmic opportunity wouldn't remain available indefinitely. Cosmic cycles would eventually move beyond this window of accelerated awakening possibility. Souls who chose continued spiritual forgetting during this crucial time would face increasingly difficult circumstances in future incarnations until they finally chose remembrance. But for those willing to embrace spiritual evolution now, Edgar foresaw possibilities beyond anything previously available on Earth. The same karmic pressures creating crisis for the spiritually asleep would facilitate unprecedented awakening for those ready to remember their divine nature. The sleeping prophet's ultimate message was both sobering and inspiring. Humanity stands at its most crucial choice point in recorded history, with both individual and collective destiny depending on each soul's decision to awaken or continue sleeping.